It's World Affairs Roundup.
The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents World Affairs Roundup, a monthly edition of International Focus providing opinion and analysis of global events, with John Katzka, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service, Ann Hamilton, political scientist at UW-Whitewater who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service, and Robert Kraig, executive director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin and author of articles and books on American foreign policy. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now, here's your moderator, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus and another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Our prescient panel of Roundup regulars has assembled once again to look at a sad state of affairs. As the UN Security Council takes up the deteriorating situation in Syria, Russia has vowed to block calls for military intervention. Is this an early Arab Spring moment? And will Moscow be left in the cold? Belt tightening. As the EU leaders struggled this week to formulate plans to address the ongoing financial crisis, proponents of austerity encountered increasing pushback. Is John Maynard Keynes making a comeback in Europe? Inconvenient allies. A leaked NATO report this week claimed Pakistan's intelligence services are actively supporting the Afghan Taliban. Meanwhile, President Obama confirmed the U.S. has mounted lethal drone strikes inside Pakistan. Is our friendship with Islamabad frayed or fractured? And William the Conqueror. As Britain deploys Prince William to the Falkland Islands in his capacity as RAF pilot to mark the 30th anniversary of the war with Argentina, Buenos Aires has cast him in the role of conquistador. Are the chilly waters of the South Atlantic about to heat up? Well, John, maybe we can start with you if you'd like to take the first swing at the situation in Syria. Tell us where we are on the ground and a little bit about how we got there.
Well, I see this issue in two dimensions. One, there is the historical background to this whole question, and let me start with that. Syria, like lots of the Arab world, is going through a awakening fueled by the social media. I mean, this is an incredible historic event in itself. But the backdrop to that is a country with a 12% ruling party, the Alawites, who are renegades within Islam, having had some rather different views and were treated like heretics by both the Sunnis and the Shias. But the Alawites, with 12%, are allied with the Shia, and the majority party in Syria, as opposed to Iraq, are the Sunnis. Now, this brings some interesting relationships. Iran is, and up to recently, Hezbollah were working with the Alawite majority, and the Arab League, which is now taking on a very different relationship, has been more or less supporting the insurgency. So that brings us up to the discussions we're having right now.
So, and where are we on the ground in terms of territory held by the regime versus the people opposed to the regime?
Well, there are conflicting reports, but it's starting to look increasingly like a civil war. There's fighting pretty much all over the country. There are reports of thousands of people dead, 7,000, 8,000 people. It's unclear. The UN stopped counting a little while ago. And the leadership of the insurgency, there are small groups that claim leadership, some outside the country that are working with groups within the country, but it's pretty quickly descending into chaos with many, many civilian deaths, and not just people on the street who are participating in some way in protests, but women, children in houses, and it's a pretty dire state of affairs.
And Robert, at the level of the international community, what's going on? What is the UN and other multilateral organizations up to?
Well, you have a situation a little like Libya in that the Arab League has been supportive of the insurgency. It started out very peaceful, but it's been so brutally repressed that it seems like it's devolving into a civil war simply because people need to defend themselves, and the regime is not very legitimate. There are even signs of defections. But the problem is that the Russians and the Chinese are in general theory against the idea that the international community should take a position on internal affairs like this, obviously thinking about their own situations. In addition, Russia and China to a lesser degree are particularly peeved by what was done with the Libyan resolution, which they think the no-fly zone was taken much further than intended. And Russia has a relationship with the Assad regime and major military contracts. And so Russia seems to be inclined, though there's been a little bit of back and forth on this, to stand against taking a strong position on the UN Security Council. I think they felt enough pressure about that from the rest of the world that they've backed off a little bit, but I still think they're seeing it as a matter of their own developing prestige and reestablishing themselves as a superpower. So that is probably the strongest thing the Assad regime has going forward. It has few friends other than those motivated by things mostly other than the Assad regime.
I think it's reasonable to say that if when Russia decides that Assad is no longer going to make it, that they will then tip. Up to that point, they are likely to resist. And this is a very interesting philosophical development as well. As we talked about the social networks that have been in play, there is another international relations device that is at play. It's called responsibility to protect. It is a growing, especially within Western circles, growing concept that we have a responsibility to intervene in countries' affairs. And the Russians and the Chinese have long resisted this kind, and not just them, but they are the leaders of the resistance to this concept.
We could end up seeing, though, if the protests get really, really bad and if Russia digs in its feet, because they're concerned, too, about an Arab Spring going north. Right. And Muslim unrest in their own country in various republics. If it could, you think of the Libya situation as being analogous, but you can also think of Kosovo. When, the geography is very different and there are a lot of differences, but when Russia refused to intervene in Kosovo, they just said, okay, we'll go through NATO. So, there are options, but none of them is very good.
And NATO has said that they're not interested in getting involved in this one. So it is complicated.
But it's amazing what impact the Arab Spring has had, in that in the Arab world overall, behavior like the Assad regime's behavior is now illegitimate, and regimes that are themselves not very democratic are taking a stand against it. So it really has changed the whole kind of politics of the Middle East.
Very much in flux.
Well, let's move a bit further to the west and the north and talk about Europe. Robert, maybe you could tell us a little bit what happened today, or this week rather, in terms of coming to some sort of agreement as the EU as to how to address this crisis.
Well, the EU, at Germany's strong urging, to put it lightly, has taken stronger austerity measures. The problem is that they're becoming increasingly unpopular. There's a realization that we're rewriting economic history to believe that you should pull back government spending in a recession. We supposedly learned during the Great Depression that is the wrong thing to do. It's what used to be done in the 19th century. And so it's something we see in this country. There's a real push in the United States for austerity as well. It has not been successful as the EU has been in pushing a strong austerity program. There are many who fear not only that it affects Europe, but it could send the whole world economy into a second deep recession. The problem is that Germany is currently, for political reasons, partly because of kind of a notion that Southern Europe and Eastern Europe have been irresponsible, right, has the power to push this austerity regime.
What an idea.
And quite frankly, it's not clear that it can be reversed at this point. There's a very strong push for it. So that's where we stand right now. I think that it has global economic implications, though, and it's becoming almost a global debate about whether or not this kind of extreme austerity is appropriate. And even a lot of sources within the IMF, which is traditionally seen in the third world as the main advocates of austerity, are saying this goes too far and it's a bad idea. And England, of course, which was ahead of the curve on austerity, has had worse job performance than they had during the Great Depression even, which is another indication that this is a very dangerous approach.
So, Anne, does this shake down to prosperous, relatively, Germany versus everyone else?
Well, I think it does, and I think that's one of the links in our stories this week is how much domestic politics is driving, it's, for example, Russia's position in the Security Council on Syria, and also this particular story with Germany. But I do think that there's a lot of pushback, and some people are saying that the actions taken to penalize countries that let their budget deficits go too high it could be part of a grand bargain where Germany insisted on this so that it could then release more money. I don't know, to the bailout fund. I think that, if you start to see large protests in Spain and Italy and France, not just Greece, where people are sort of saying, okay, well, we can, we expected that, it could tip the hat in the against austerity. But I think that might be what has to happen.
Well, and John, what about the sovereignty issue? I mean, basically, the agreement that was reached by 25 out of the 27 members really constrains the individual governments in what they can do, does it not?
Well, it actually even goes beyond that, because Germany last week attempted to take over the taxation and the budget of Greece, and they were voted down in the process, but it has not gone away. I see this issue in a different way. I recognize the economics of it, but Europe, which we have pointed to as this wonderful social machine, has, in my estimation, lived beyond their means for so long that it's time for it to ratchet back. And there may be demonstrations and riots. It's obviously with Spain's unemployment, youth unemployment at over 50%, that this is going to take to the street. But I don't think it changes the dynamic. And the idea that governments can spend and that creates jobs is something that I haven't seen in my lifetime.
So what about this notion that there needs to be some middle ground between austerity and stimulus?
Well, Germany is the broker of that. And we would keep coming back to the German role in this process. And I think it is critical. And Germany, even though they have well-established social programs, also have done them in a much more fiscally responsible way, something that a number of the other countries have not.
Yeah, I think public spending, it cannot be all jobs, right? We know that the private sector is critical, but it's a major part of economies, and you can't just decide that we're going to pull it back, especially during a recession, and think that you're not going to actually make the private sector and economy worse and kind of like cause a downward spiral. We've had the same debate here in Wisconsin about austerity during the recession as well.
This is a domestic debate, isn't it?
Yeah. And so, but I think the austerity argument, it's more of a moral argument than it is an actual economic argument that's based on economic history or the findings of academic economists.
And it's also ideological, very ideological.
Well,
yes, we'll leave it there.
We'll leave Europe and take a short break. We'll be right back with more International Focus.
Oh, no blood on that one.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus and our World Affairs Roundup. Well, Anne, there was an interesting report leaked from NATO today regarding the Pakistani government and its role in the battle against the Taliban. Tell us about that.
Well, this was a report called The State of the Taliban, I think was the name of it, and it was compiled of reports based on 27,000 interviews with 4,000 captured Taliban fighters and other foreign fighters. And so it was immediately after they were captured. And it reveals some pretty disturbing news for the legitimacy of the war that we're fighting, the legitimacy of NATO as well. It indicates, for example, that that many senior Afghan government officials are talking about going over to the Taliban. It reveals the extent to which Pakistan is controlling the situation with Taliban and how many of the Taliban leaders actually live in Pakistan near their intelligence service
We've
quarters.
got one quote here from the report which says, senior Taliban leaders meet regularly with ISI intelligence personnel who advise on strategy and relay any pertinent concerns of the government of Pakistan. So,
this is nothing new.
Right.
I mean, Admiral Mullen, the former chief of staff of the Defense Department, testified to this before Congress not that long ago. So this is information we know. I'm just amazed as to why this was leaked at this particular time. Mm-hmm. And also, at the same time, we have Secretary
Clinton. Hillary Clinton?
No, in the Defense Department.
Oh.
Panetta. Panetta, thank you. Secretary Panetta flying to a NATO meeting to discuss the French decision to pull out earlier. And on the way, he's saying he ups our ante or changes the date that we are going to switch from 2014 to 2013. So, you know, here I'm on the ground there, and I'm a Taliban commander, and I'm looking around at these allies who are looking for an exit strategy and are looking for the door. How much am I going to compromise in that kind of a situation?
I think the report also revealed that was more interesting than the Pakistan-Taliban relationship was the level of popular support for the Taliban based on their local programs. And so it sort of made me think again of Tip O'Neill, all politics is local, you know, because they're providing services that the national government cannot provide, which is getting them a lot of support from the people. So.
Well, and in as much as the central government is really the centerpiece of the U.S. strategy, you know, that's problematic, isn't it, Robert?
Well, right, and I agree with John that it's not new news per se, though it's very overwhelming as far as the documentation.
Right.
But it is reminiscent of Vietnam in the sense that we refuse to understand that South Vietnam was not a viable political entity and hadn't been for 10 years when we escalated the Vietnam War. I think everyone knows that this regime will fall apart when we leave, and that and the war is unwinnable. This is the real downside could be that if you have an election result in the United States that leads to us escalating and then simply putting off the inevitable rather than realizing that the reason for the war no longer exists and it's an unwinnable war because the central government and its allies, the warlords, are not a tenable political force in the country, and it will go Taliban, which is a complicated concept. The Taliban are not monolithic, but some elements of the Taliban will take over at some point.
Look at Pakistan's role in this. And yes, they have been duplicitous in terms of how they have dealt with us and how they have dealt with Afghanistan. But on the other hand, there are the ethnic, religious ties to the Pashtuns, and remember that Pakistan's #1 enemy is India, and anything that weakens them in terms of their borders and their border relationships and causes them to focus in that direction is a problem for them.
So is this, to extend your analogy, Robert, is this 1973 Vietnam? I mean, are we just leaving the peace talks at Paris and having decided what the ultimate fate is going to be anyway, and it's just a matter of how we implement it?
Well, I think it was 1973 and 1964 as far as Vietnam as well, but it's inevitable. And just the question is an exit strategy, because the reason, by the way, the report also finds that Al-Qaeda is not controlling the Taliban in any way, and that they have to ask permission even to do any operations in the country as to the other outside extremist forces. So we're not exactly fighting terrorism by fighting this war. It's a question of saving face in domestic politics.
So there's no
domestic politics theme.
There's no sort of useful purpose for extending at least through the original withdrawal date?
It's hard to see any useful purpose at this point.
But it's also looking at, from the logistical standpoint, this is not something you can turn around after building it up to this point. There is not just the military presence, there is all the democracy building and other civil society programs that are in place that have to either wind down or morph into something else.
So does Leon Panetta's apparent moving of that deadline hasten the departure of virtually everyone else? I mean, would you look for a rush to the exit going forward?
Yeah, who would want to stay on if, with your economic troubles at home in Europe, where principally our allies are coming from, why would you want to be extended? Britain, now with our next topic to be discussed, might have other interests in mind.
As far as our allies, yes. As far as us, it depends on our presidential election. If someone's elected on the grounds of being tough on terrorism and not losing Afghanistan, just like Nixon would not lose Vietnam, then we could put off the inevitable and waste more resources and lives. Yeah.
Well, on to our final topic of the day. Britain is steaming towards the South Atlantic once again in defense of the Falklands.
Dauntlessly.
Mm-hmm. And tell us what's going on there.
Well, the 30th anniversary of the Falklands-Malvinas War of April 1982 is fast approaching. That war was never, it came to a conclusion, but there was never a real settlement of the issues. The Argentines still claim the islands as their own. It's a very, very emotional topic. It's having lived in Argentina at that time and gone back, it's a topic that most people make fun of because it's just a few thousand sheep herders there. At least that's how we used to see it. But it's incredibly emotional. It's a little bit like China and Taiwan. You know, they really firmly believe that it is theirs, and it's a nationalist rallying cry all the time. So the fact that the British have announced that they are sending William down for a 6-week stint in search and rescue helicopter missions.
Yeah, not exactly a fighter pilot guy.
On this really fancy new warship called the HMS Dauntless is really getting them upset. And it's already in the context of a tense situation that's arisen over a number of commercial issues. The Argentines have blocked ships who are flying the flag of the Falkland Islands. They've got an agreement with Paraguay, Uruguay, Brazil to not accept those ships. So there's a ratcheting up of the tensions there, and it's very emotional.
And why now, Robert?
Well, 30th anniversary is one reason. I think there are good domestic reasons for both sides to want to have this little battle, right? And now we, of course, know that, of course, this complicates everything. Now, apparently, a vast oil reserve has been discovered, and American oil companies and British are competing for the contract. And, of course, the Argentines, this will infuriate them. They believe it's their oil, and the Brits are going to be happy to sell it off. So that escalates things. We would have had this anyway, but that's added an even stronger motivation to the controversy.
And one of the bidders is Anadarko, a huge American oil concern. And what would sort of a formal letting of that contract to a large American firm, which incidentally has ties with the defense establishment, have on British claims and the situation generally?
I think you answered your own question. I see this thing from a slightly different viewpoint. I see this as Argentinian leadership in a bit of trouble. They've had a long drought. The economy, as elsewhere, is slipping. Popular support is still there, but it could be coming under pressure. And looking around for foreign boogeymen is a traditional way in which people deflect away from the problems internally.
Well, and as we were talking earlier about austerity, I would assume austerity extends to defense budgets. Might there be a connection for the defense establishment in Britain to want to look useful?
Well, it's lucky they built that Dauntless, right? That apparently escaped the austerity program. You know, a little war. Well, there probably will not be a shooting war, I don't think. We should be clear about that. Most people seem to agree on that, Dave.
I agree on that. I think it's interesting with the movie The Iron Lady that just came out, you know, and they're showing Margaret Thatcher and the Falklands War and the British soldiers being killed. So this is in theaters. People are watching it right now, right. So it's very...
255 British and 650 Argentinians were killed in that conflict.
Yeah.
So what's the end game? Does the anniversary pass and tempers cool? Or?
Well, let's hope it's the mouse that roars.
Well, and
there's also the Chilean problem, because the Argentines are threatening the Chileans to cut off their air route, the one flight between Chile and Port Stanley every week, and also it's having repercussions on their plane routes into Buenos Aires itself. So it has a lot of sort of regional implications as well.
Well, before we go, John, I understand you have a commercial announcement for our viewers.
For those of you who are familiar with Great Decisions, up in Cedarburg and Grafton over the next, beginning on the 9th of February, for 4 weeks, we're going to talk about 4 of the topics of the Great Decisions program. So if you're interested, contact your libraries in those areas, and I look forward to seeing you there.
Very good. Well, pleasure as always. We'll see you next time. To our viewers, we'll see you next week on International Focus.
Information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,